We've been going over the book Delivered Out of Empire by Walter Brueggemann. Subtitle of the book is Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 1. And this week we're going over Chapter 8, which is entitled Multitude Without Pedigree or Genealogy. And the verse that he pulls out as our point of focus is Exodus chapter 12, verse 38, which reads, "A mixed crowd also went up with them, and livestock in great numbers, both flocks and herds." Last week, Sue, I believe you alluded to this passage, this verse in passing, or this idea that when the people of Israel left, they left with a multitude of other types of persons. And this week's chapter is fairly straightforward. Brueggemann wants us to notice that the multitude that left Egypt with Moses and Aaron was truly a motley crew, diverse in many ways. The group that would eventually come to identify as a singular nation, the Israelites, began as an amalgamation of Egypt's outcast. To quote from page 61 of the book, on the one hand, the Israelites suggests a fully formed, readily identified community, the one that will occupy the storyline of the Old Testament. On the other hand, mixed multitude suggests a sociological awareness that a company of escaping slaves does not enjoy the luxury of a fixed identity or genealogy. And then again, quoting from page 62, the phrase that is translated mixed multitude conjures a disordered or confused array of folk without ethnic or linguistic identity. That phrase, moreover, suggests a large host of them, so that we witness the contest between the ordered, no doubt limited army of Pharaoh and the mass of ill-identified people who rush to freedom, even while the army pursues them. The contrast attests to the sociological reality that the lower one descends to the that the lower one descends on the socioeconomic scale, the less there is identifiable genealogy or pedigree that can be offered. Brueggemann posits that as time passed, and as Israel's memory of its time in Egypt faded, it began to see itself as a distinct people comprised of persons of a specific lineage and pedigree. Quoting from page 62, as soon as Israel was settled into a relative security and affluence, the social differentiation began to appear. The juxtaposition of Israelite and mixed multitude disappeared, and Israel took on all the trappings of an identifiable people with a heritage, a land claim, a genealogy, and a pedigree. Former slaves became owners, possessors, and administrators, and such social functions mandate credentials. Those credentials in Israel took the form of holiness rules and purity guidelines so that religious merit went easily along with economic clout. Initially, the multitude was considered by Yahweh to be a holy people, Yahweh's treasured possession, a priestly kingdom, and a holy nation. That special status, however, is not yet cast as ethnic identity, but is based simply on obeying Yahweh's voice. That is, the voice of Torah and keeping the covenant. His point here is really that when we notice that it is a multitude of diverse peoples that are brought out of Egypt, that the invitation to be God's treasured possession and priestly kingdom and holy nation is not contingent on their genealogy. I mean, many of them were possibly descendants of, or certainly were descendants of Egyptians and other diverse peoples that found themselves as part of the slave caste, but rather their identity as treasured possession is found in keeping Yahweh's commands by way of the Torah. In other words, keeping the covenant and keeping in right relation with Yahweh, which is a relationship that cuts through genealogical lines. Quoting from page 63, but the notion of holy nation over time triggered a zeal for purity, a practice or ritual cleanliness, and a claim of holiness that was not identified as a relation with Yahweh, but as a substantive essence that came to be expressed in ethnic categories. This perspective came to regard being mixed, as in Exodus 12:38, as dangerous and offensive violation of holiness. Centuries later, during the time of the Persian exile, such exclusionary practices along ethnic lines would manifest in an attempt to preserve national identity in the context of diaspora and exile. Brueggemann notes how the prophetic writings of Nehemiah and especially of Ezra chronologue these developments. Quoting from page 63, Ezra, the leader of the post-exiled elite, was resolved to create a community of pure Torah keepers. His intent required separation from all those who did not qualify to meet his Torah norms. Then here, quoting from the book of Ezra, chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, we read an example of this very thing. It goes, "After these things had been done, the officials approached me being Ezra, and said, 'The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands, and in this faithlessness the officials and leaders have led the way. When I heard this, I tore my garments and my mantle and pulled hair from my head and beard and sat appalled.'" In response to this, Brueggemann writes in pages 63 and 64, "This report is loaded with a certain view of Israel that is marked by heavily freighted ideological terms, thus mixed, separated, and holy seed. This triad of terms suggests the notion that Israel is distinct in every regard. Thus, the term seed refers to semen, so that the distinctiveness of Israel is maintained by protected sexual transmission." Key takeaway, quote from page 64, "Thus one may trace the articulation of Israel all the way from mixed multitude to holy seed, all the way from inclusiveness that was not preoccupied with matters of holiness to an exclusion based on bloodlines. We may surmise, moreover, that the more the memory of slavery, emancipation remained palpable, the more the inclusion could be embraced. Conversely, the more remote the memory of slavery and emancipation became, the tighter the lines might be drawn on holiness." And by holiness there, he doesn't mean righteous practice or righteous religious practice or morality, broadly speaking. He means in keeping with the Levitical code and those books of Deuteronomy and all of their minute detail. Brueggemann points out that this development is by no means linear, but shifts between inclusion and exclusion and then back again, waxes and wanes century by century and in various historical contexts. And so you can read periods of Israel's history where the emphasis was placed on finding ways of living well with neighbor and even being a blessing to neighbors, as was the call to Abraham to be a blessing to the nations. And then other times where they circle the wagons and live with the perception that all of the surrounding peoples are their not only sworn enemy, but enemy by way of their genealogy. It's in the blood, as it were. And this tension between seeing one's culture and tribe as a mixed multitude or as holy seed carries to this day. And this much should be obvious to anyone who is alive and paying attention. Or as Brueggemann puts it, the tension between inclusiveness of mixed multitude and the exclusiveness of holy seed remained unresolved in ancient Israel and in emerging Judaism. That same tension, moreover, spilled into the Christian tradition as well. The first Christians were all Jews, and they debated about the degree to which Gentiles were to be included in their fledgling movement. Brueggemann writes on page 65, "The early church struggled about whether and in what ways to break beyond the bounds of Judaism in which it had been birthed in order to reach Gentiles. This issue was not an easy one, for some interpretive traditions of Judaism would find Gentiles who did not obey Torah to be unclean and so disqualified for membership. Thus, Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 16, concerning what is clean or unclean for religious participation. Paul's interpretation of Hebrew scripture found warrant in Abraham as a blessing to the nations, Genesis 12, verse 3, as a ground for including Gentiles in the community of faith. And the scriptures, he's quoting from, here we're quoting from Galatians chapter 3, verses 8 through 9, and the scriptures foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith declared the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the Gentiles shall be blessed by you. For this reason, those who believe are blessed with Abraham who believed. He goes on to write, The inclusion of Gentiles in the community of the church means that we have come full circle to the mixed multitude that was inclusive of all those who accepted the emancipatory action of God without claiming pedigree or genealogy. Brueggemann points us to the story in Acts chapter 2, where persons from every tribe and tongue are brought together by way of a work of the Holy Spirit. He writes, "The sweep of the Spirit rejected no one and issued no purity requirement that would have separated some and excluded others. The company given us in the narrative is exactly a mixed multitude from many national and linguistic groups, a multitude of many peoples, all empowered by the Spirit and all drawn to the emancipatory narrative of Jesus." In Revelation chapter 5, verse 10, we see how, quoting again, "the furthest reach of the hope of the New Testament is a gathering of this mixed multitude into a congregation that sings praise to God to all eternity." Brueggemann wants us to see that the struggle between top-down hegemonic power and bottom-up power from the multitude is age-old. It manifests across cultures, governments, and religious institutions. What was true in the times of Moses and of Jesus is true today. National identities and cultural lines are formed around physiological traits and genealogical backgrounds. Preferred genetic traits have at times become litmus tests for inclusion or exclusion. Class divisions have been drawn up along economic and racial lines. Echoes to Pharaoh's rule are heard again and again, whether in the antebellum South, Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, Northern Ireland under British rule. The list goes on and on. If only the church's record was unblemished, but alas, quoting from page 68, "This ancient contest that God's people endlessly replicate in serious, sometimes acrimonious ways can readily be transposed into an issue about the unity and purity of the church. The purity of the church functions invariably by exclusion to eliminate all those who do not meet the norm. By contrast, an accent on unity tends to welcome without imposing distinctions and qualifications and thus envisions a multitude. The defining mark of this multitude is not race or language or pedigree or genealogy or even right belief. It is rather to be poor, to be among the ones left behind by the force of empire. Such nobodies without claims or name that is recognized rallied to Moses. They departed Egypt and became the people of the covenant. There was in that emancipatory drama no holy seed, but only the poor gathered to become a new historical possibility. That surely is the plot of the Exodus narrative that is repeatedly performed so that those who are not a people become God's people. Or to quote 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10, "Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." And I'll ask that you unmute yourselves for our questions for discussion. The first is, in tracing how Israel variously defines itself as a mixed multitude or a set-apart holy seed, the author asserts on page 65 that the more the Torah is kept in proximity to the emancipatory narrative of the Exodus, the more fully is the notion of mixed multitude definitional for Israel. How does the idea of mixed multitude, free from hierarchical distinctions and ethnic separation, go hand in hand with God's action of emancipation? What makes a person part of the Torah community if no qualifications of rank, pedigree, or purity are required?
I think from the beginning it was faith. Abraham's faith, Isaac's faith, Joseph's faith.
Yes, and that's what Paul will highlight again and again in his letters. And I'm reminded here of those various stories in the Old Testament where outsiders find themselves included by way of faith, like Rahab or Ruth or Naomi and others who, based on the litmus test of genealogy or holy seed, they don't make the mark at all. And yet they become heroes of the faith and even included in the list of Jesus's lineage as people who are, it gets us to see that even the people who would lead up to the birth of Jesus, who are part of his ancestry, were representative of this same motley crew that left Egypt as a mixed multitude.
I guess I've been sort of dumb about this all along. This was like a revelation to me, to realize that the group that left Egypt was not just the Hebrew people, but it was a whole bunch of people, all the slaves and people who were oppressed in the Egyptian nation. And so why do they have all these lineages in the Bible, like in Matthew 1, this whole lineage to show that, who Jesus was descended from,
Well, the lineages in the Gospels are subversive in that they highlight various persons that were part of that lineage that were precisely the wrong sort. So you have Rahab the prostitute mentioned in there. You have and other persons of low degree, low pedigree, to make a point that for those who are interested in blue blood aristocracy kind of thinking, that Jesus, born in a humble environment to humble people of humble lineage, and even naming David, which seems, it's kingly, right? Except that he was, the 11th of 12 sons, or the 10th, I forget, not the one who would have seemed the obvious choice to even have inherited the kingship. And so it's not so much that the lineage is important as to show that, except to the degree that it shows that it's precisely from the wrong sort of people that Jesus came, that Mary, mother of Jesus, would come, and his surrogate father Joseph would come, is the point. But I missed that as well as you did for a long time. But it makes sense when you think about how slavery typically does work. You can think of slavery here in North America, in the United States, and you could think of slavery as it was in South America, and where you have as an end result of very diverse people of various hues. In South America, in Brazil especially, there's a whole sort of a subcaste system that they're trying to break out of and improving on, where that you can know your caste based on the tone of your skin. And so because the slave owners would have children or intermarry with the slaves, and of course slaves in the antebellum South were multiple places is documented how slave owners would rape and make babies with their slaves. And so what you end up with is quite a lot of diversity as a result of this exploitative system. And anybody who would have left with the Israelites, centuries into this enslavement would have been, various degrees of part Egyptian, if not in cultural practice, but in fact, in terms of their genetics, it's not really as surprising when you think about it, but it's something that's often missed on a quick reading.
But so all those people who escaped Egypt and went with Moses, so they all became the Israelite nation, or is that right? They all became like the Hebrew people or the Israelite people.
That's what Brueggemann is saying. Now, it depends on which part of the narrative you read, because there are other times where the person, whoever recorded the scriptures, is wanting us to be very clear that there are 12 houses of Israel traced back to the 12 children of Jacob, and that idea of being included based off of heritage and genealogy and holy seed becomes more important. And Brueggemann is trying to bring us back to this foundation, the foundational story, where when they left, is precisely as you were just asking. Yes, they were a mixed multitude, which makes sense considering what we know about how slavery typically works.
I was thinking about this as I was reading this and how they left with them. And I'm thinking, they probably intermarried with the people around them. And so when it came time to leave, they didn't leave behind the families they'd married into. They all came with them. And then thinking on down the road, I thought, when the temple's built, three clans were on each side of the tent. Okay, if we've got all these people that are not in families, where are their tents? Scripture doesn't tell us that over in the southwest corner were the tents of the Egyptians. So that's what made me kind of come to the conclusion that they were probably married in, just like the slaves here that he was talking about. And it may have been if a Israelite married someone that was an Egyptian and things were going sort of well with everything, that they may have brought along another part of the family with them. So, yeah, that's where my thinking went as I read this.
Yeah. The overarching point, though, is inclusion. As you were describing there, it would be true in the scenario you just described, Sue. Inclusion is into the community of God's beloved people. God's is faithfulness to the covenant and to the Torah, not being born into the right house or of the right lineage, genetically speaking. And history is filled with problems that arise, stories about problems that arise from people thinking that they are especially privileged simply by virtue of into what house they were born into. I mean, in Europe, it became so ridiculous that, cousins were marrying cousins, and it's where we get the term blue blood because of the genetic mutations that would arise from this way of thinking, but also this idea that certain houses, kingly houses, whether it be in, England, France, wherever, or the Habsburg dynasty in Austria and Germany, that these are people who are especially ordained by God to lead, when their character and their capabilities would strongly suggest otherwise. And it leads to all kinds of it leads to all kinds of problems, to put it mildly. Not to mention just the problems of seeing certain bloodlines or races as preferred or better, which again, given the history of Europe during World War II and even racist movements here in the United States that see things that way, it's problematic to say the least. And Brueggemann's wanting us to point out that at the Exodus story, what you have in the people who rise up from the bottom as God's people and are blessed by God are people from the dregs of society who find their place only by their acceptance of God's ways and ways of living well in community. And
I just had a thought. My oldest sister is adopted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we never think of her as being adopted.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking that perhaps this is kind of like an adoption into the clan.
That's a helpful way of looking at it, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But Janet, you were about to say something. What were you going to say?
What exactly is the holy seed? Is this just the line of Abraham and kind of what comes up, like Nancy talking about in Matthew, the lineage, is that considered the holy seed?
Well, the way that Brueggemann is using it is in the sense that the prophetic books of Ezra and Nehemiah use it, which is quite literally a genetic lineage to the verified houses within Israel, the ones that are for certain parts of the tribes of Israel, genetically pure. And he's lamenting the fact that Israel has and members of the holy houses have married and intermarried with others. And so Israel's salvation in that time was sought out by way of circling the wagons and preserving this strong sense of national identity tied with being of the right lineage. And Brueggemann is saying that, there are times in Israel's history where both of those ideas were dominant, and he's wanting us call us back to the beginning of Israel's narrative as a people, where when it left Exodus, it left as a mixed multitude. So holy seed here is being used in the sense that other people would talk about racial purity. So it's not ideal, not preferred, not the way that God calls people together. God calls people together in covenant relation, is what Brueggemann is trying to say. And when we become fixated on this idea of holy seed and who has it, that's where you lead to sectarian divisions and unhealthy nationalistic identities. As the easiest example in modern history is to point to the way that
it looks like as it goes, it would just kind of marry.
Say that again. You broke up a little bit. I don't know if you're talking, but you're not coming
Well,
through.
you did too. I was saying, it seems like as I'm not coming through.
You are now.
Okay.
I can hear you.
It seems like the holy seed would become less important and would kind of blend in to the mixed multitude as time goes on.
The idea is one of the reason why Brueggemann brings up examples from the New Testament to show how in many ways Jesus's ministry was a call to return to first principles, where a mixed multitude is welcomed into the work that God is doing, is to point to that exact thing, that the holy seed matters less in a literal, if you're thinking of it in terms of racial purity, which I hate even saying, but if you think of it in terms of that, that means nothing when you realize that God is creating communities, calling communities together by way of the Holy Spirit that transcend those those barriers that we place. And so that's why that last line of this question, what makes a person part of the Torah community if no qualifications of rank, pedigree, or purity are required? What Stu began with, which is faithfulness, faithfulness to the call of God, to live in keeping with God's ways. That's what's required. And so we'll move on to the next question, because it's related to what we're just talking about. Number 2, which reads, with the arrival of security and affluence, human communities, including biblical Israel and the Christian church in its wake, seek to establish their identity in terms of social differentiation and credentials. Where does this desire come from? Do you recognize this desire in yourself? How does God's dogged commitment to emancipate push back against codification of hierarchy in Scripture and in the world around us? I think this question is perfectly suited to a disciples church, because we come out of a movement that initially rejected even titles of clerics, even terms like reverend, like I am reverend. and other things like that.
But the fact that you couldn't take communion unless you had done certain things
Mm-hmm.
before. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the table's open to every believer. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the main thing. I think that's what causes differences, is the way we all interpret different different parts of the Bible and how we're
Yeah.
supposed
That's the beauty of the table, the communion table, in that it's hard to interpret a table as anything other than what it is, which is a place where food sits for people to come and eat. I think it's a real gift that our denomination has to give.
Mm-hmm. I think where does this desire come from? I think just comes from people wanting to gravitate towards people that around them that think the same way, act the same way, which makes separation on separation on separation, which is why we have so many different denominations of churches. You get a church that, you know, starts to go one way, and then a segment of that church doesn't want to go that way, so they create a new church. So if we're just talking of churches, then specifically, but we do that within our social lives too. We tend to gravitate toward people with people that have the same interests, the same maybe common goals or whatever. We just tend to do that.
When we make idols, you know, one of the stories that will come up here in the book of Exodus is that well-known story of them making a golden calf. And when people make an idol, and when people made idols back then, they would make them to embody certain attributes that they thought of as the best attributes for God to have. So there are idols that archaeologists will dig up where there might be a multi-breasted goddess. And the idea is God is a God of fertility that overflows in an abundance of life. To make a God that was a bowl, like the Israelites would do, melting down all of the jewels to make a bowl, is to suggest that they think God should be a God of brute strength, raw power, kind of God that could bowl you over, that could knock you down into it was in that region. It was a sign of that kind of strength and even military strength. And commentators on that passage note that the tendency is very understandable to create a God in the image you would expect God to be in based on your own values, which is to say that when we create an idol, we create an idol that in some way or another reflects our own image back at us, what our values are, our priorities are, how we assume God operates in the world. And so we make a God, as sure as there's a white bearded man on the top of the Sistine Chapel reaching out to Adam, we make a God that's crafted after our sensibilities. And idolatry, idolatry works that way. And so when we create God in our own image with our priorities and our objectives, thinking that we're receiving God by divine revelation, but really just sort of projecting onto God, it's no surprise that we come away from that form of worship with an assumption that anybody who would think differently about our God and our sensibilities would be our natural enemy or just wrong. And yeah, I think that it's not surprising to me at all that one of the first things out of this story that we'll come to see when Moses is up on the mountain receiving the word, the first tendency of the people when they feel unmoored and perhaps trying to learn what it's like to live in this, amidst a multitude of diverse people on their own, that they turn to a form of idolatry, creating a God as they could best conceptualize God. I say several times, you've probably heard me say from sermons, that here in our country, we think of God sometimes as a bigger and better Captain America is our sort of our civic idolatry. Anyway, I'm sneaking a sermon in. I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that. Stay on tap.
Going with the golden calf is also, I think, reflects the generational experience of Israel in slavery within a different country. So they picked up a lot of those influences and values, and got scared and, okay, we got to go back to the old ways. And we end up building an idol in whatever various forms that we put it in.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because in Egypt, there was this thing called the Apis Bowl. And the best of my recollection, I haven't looked at this for a hot second, but the best of my recollection is the Apis Bowl was this holy bull, holy cow, this holy animal that was revered and deference was given to it. And I forget exactly what religious practice centered around the life of this Apis bull, but when it died, they would mummify it, and they've dug up several mummified Apis bulls, these cows that were mummified, and there would be a successor would somehow be chosen. I don't know exactly what the process was, but they would find a new Apis bull to be like, the replacement. And I don't know. I only bring it up because it's interesting that the Israelites would go into the desert to make a bull. But I only bring it up because I don't know to what degree that practice was part of what they brought out of Egypt and what made them think to craft a bull. I don't know. I guess that's a comment that's neither here nor there at this point. We'll have to see what we discover when we get up to that part of the story. But anyway, let's move on to the third question. Oh, hi, Larry, by the way. I didn't realize you joined us. Welcome. It's good.
Late as usual.
That's okay. I'm glad to hear your voice. The last question, and congratulate ourselves. We got to the last question this week. The earliest emphasis of both Judaism and the early Christian church envisions a community in relationship with God defined by, quote, a readiness to move to an alternative existence outside the reach of predatory regime. In Jesus's context, he means Rome, the Roman Empire, and various other empires. In Moses' context, he means Egypt by that. No other identifying markers or qualifications are necessary. What does this community of nobodies look like in the early church, in the imagery of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and in Revelation chapter 5? How does this mixed multitude of people, once exploited and now empowered by the Spirit, threaten the powers that be? How can we participate in bringing about this kind of community today?
I think everybody speaks out now.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah,
I think
I'm not
it's
sure
great.
either, but
That's very reflective of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you, Larry.
I think it's reflective of, again, we're unsure. And so we go back to old ideas or old political references or wherever we feel comfortable. And we're certainly seeing that today in my viewpoint anyhow.
What I was thinking in terms of really not understanding the question is that when the Israelites were left Egypt, they knew what it was like not to be on top. And you can kind of almost see a desire to be on top, which then started to separate people from each other.
That's where my mind went. My mind went to a more recent historical example, and by recent I mean about 400 years old. But in our country, initially, there was very few sociological differences or privileges given to white or black slaves. And so they would often work for the same masters. This is before the United States was even a nation. This is like, think the colonies. And they would meet in the same public houses, and they would even come to speak the same languages by way of their interactions. You can't help but, if you live with somebody for any period of time, you come to speak the same languages and find commonality, similar to our great multitude that left Egypt in our story today. And so what happened was there was a man with the last name Bacon, not Francis Bacon, the philosopher. I forget his first name right offhand. It might have been something like John or something like that. But his last name was Bacon, and he was a plantation owner in Virginia. And he raised a rebellion that overthrew, that burned down multiple plantations and destroyed several of the wealthy landowners' properties. And it was a rebellion that was led by Black and white people, or what we now think of as Black and white people. Even those categories were just beginning to be used for reasons of keeping power where they wanted to keep it. But anyway, this terrified the Commonwealth of Virginia, and they put down the rebellion by way of their militia. Now, before I go on, I should say that Bacon wasn't trying to emancipate anybody. The reason he was upset and formed his rebellion was because the Commonwealth of Virginia wouldn't give him troops to push further into Native American territory to enlarge his plantation. Okay, they didn't think it was a good idea because they didn't want to upset the Native Americans any more than already had been done, given the way things were at that time. And this is why he did what he did. So don't think of him as some sort of, I don't know, ideological purist or anything. But anyway, after this happened, the Commonwealth of Virginia began to place in the legal codes differences between persons of darker skin and persons of lighter skin. So they were no longer allowed to eat in the same taverns, for instance. So they're no longer meeting and finding opportunities to learn the same languages and to bond in these ways. And the people who were poor whites were given off ramps out of their servitude. So this is where we get the concept of indentured servants. Now, spoiler alert, they very seldom lived long enough to have experienced their freedom because their situations were so terrible, but they could theoretically, work long enough, 10 years or whatever, and find freedom in that way. And these were privileges that were not given to the brown slaves in our country, well, at least in the Commonwealth of Virginia at the time. And there was a tactical reason for this, because it kept the poor white people just slightly above the enslaved Black people. And that difference kept them, there's a reason why a lot of the racial racist sentiment are expressed in what we think of in our country as white trash, which is a pejorative, derogatory term for poor white people. But there's a reason why oftentimes racism manifests stronger amongst that class, because it was a class that was cultivated from our country's inception to put a difference between people who theoretically should share common purposes and common identity, but can no longer do so because they're not finding opportunities to learn the same language and to feel some sense of solidarity. And so indentured white servants would think, well, at least I don't have it as bad as them below me, and I feel like any advancement for them would be a threat to me. So it built this great animosity between peoples that should have been able to have and had before found solidarity. So where my mind went to here is, when poor people and people who are exploited of diverse backgrounds are able to find common identity. When poor workers across color lines find, factory work exploitative, when poor persons across gender lines can find that their fights are one and the same. And you could go on like that. That is a threat to the powers that be, that profit for like Pharaoh's empire did off of cheap labor. And so it becomes very important to keep people divided and to keep people working against one another. And so that's where my mind went with this, because that actually, it does happen has happened in recent history. And even in the civil rights movement into the 20th century, there were society, misinformation societies that would pump propaganda into the ether about to keep people from being sympathetic to the plight of workers or poor people, broadly speaking. So that's where my head went. I know I just said a lot, so I guess I'll end it. I'll end there. But
I think that's what the government's doing today, trying to separate people so they can get their way.
Well, our politicians do like to keep the political divides in the political camps firmly entrenched. I do think that's true. Yeah.
Well, going back to something that you said and that people find, when they're in close proximity, they find common ground, they find common interest. And then once it gets to a point where, then they start looking for the differences, that it's easier to find the similarities to get communication going, but then they start looking for differences too. And then that starts to separate people. This may be a very poor example of how can we participate in bringing about this kind of community today. Is there's an advertisement for a lotion, a skin lotion or something like that, and it says for all who have skin. And if we could start looking at everybody like that, as opposed to looking for all those little individual differences initially, I just thought, it doesn't break it down into saying, dry skin or oily skin or whatever. It just says skin. It just, that simple one word.
When one of the things that I found surprising as I was learning more about the biblical world and the way that slavery functioned in Roman times was that their caste system had more to do with national identities than with skin color. And so if you were a slave in the Roman Empire, you might be darker skin or lighter skin, and that really wasn't the difference. There were other reasons why Rome may have designated you as the class to have been slave. During the time of the European slave trade, in the 15 and 1600s, that was when Black became a designation as a distinction, that a category that was basically invented for the purpose of justifying chattel slavery. And so we think that people always have thought in terms of color differences as the identifying markers. But you can actually see read in documents around the time, the development of this as an idea, which goes to show that if you could come up with this as an idea, then you can also undo that as an idea. There's still a lot of work to be done in that regard, to say the least. But and it's not an easy thing to come to see ourselves as this mixed multitude responding in faithfulness to God's call. It's in our churches that have balconies, and I can't say as to why this is the case here, but in churches in the South that have balconies, those balconies, and in the North too, before civil rights era, in desegregation really took over. The balconies were for integrated churches so that the Black people could go in the balcony. So that was thought of as progress, as a way of.
I think at Northwood, the balcony was for the youth.
Yeah. That's I guess a more understandable reason to, because as I remember what it was like to sit in church myself and put my knees up on the pew and talk incessantly to the person next to me. So, and then paid for it when I got home. But
the balcony separation was also, if you are familiar with Cane Ridge, which the disciples have sort of immortalized down in Kentucky. But I don't know, I remember when I was in high school and the spirit, was our school was best. And then I went to college and I started changing. And I guess as I got more education and I traveled. As you know, I've been to Canada several times, but then Jen and I got married. So I've been to Asia several times and across Europe. And you say, hey, there's a lot of people out here who are probably similar to me, may not look like me, but there's a shared commonality, if I can use that word. And well, that was my personal experience. I don't know if that really relates to what Bergman is getting at, but I think that's what it brings up in my memory.
Well, we're almost at an
I have
hour.
something I could share on that.
Sure.
Because I'm with you about when you see these things. It says China is a country in a far off place where people live who have no face. It's a country hard to understand with unique things in its land. Panda bears, Buddhas, and strange food all produce alien and foreign mood. History that goes back thousands of years, telling of people's trials and fears. China is a country in a far off place where people live that have no face. China is a country in a far off place where you meet people face to face. When you see their faces and their smiles, the distance is not measured by the miles. All of this foreign seems to vanish as we discover the things that we cherish. A place to live and a family to love fits each of us just like a glove. China's in the country in a far off place until you meet the people face to face. China's in the country in a far off place. We have seen the other through his grace. All this began and had a start when we looked into the other's heart. Each of us discover and have to give. Each of us discover a new way to live. I thank God for the alien things and all the happiness that it brings. China is not a country in a far place. I will always see China in your face.
That, Sue, was a lovely thing to have read and a good place for us to end, because I think that it captivates the sentiment of this lesson perfectly. Thank you.
That's the way I felt after I went to China.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, and that encompasses way more than what I was saying, but that's kind of where I was going with, was we see, we should be looking at what we have in common.
Yeah.
No class next week. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I have a retreat, a virtual spiritual retreat with Bill Kincaid through this thing called First Seasons Project. And so I will not be available, but we'll have it next Wednesday, February 9th. And so read chapter 9. And that's all for today. Let me bring you back so I can see your faces before we leave. And thank you for everything. And I hope to see you soon, and be well, Sue and John. Good idea to play it safe, and I hope to see you all Sunday. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.